Well, hopefully some more people will be joining us. We are talking about religion and ethics this week, right? Hot dog. Very significant. Hot dog. What is that like? So old. I think Goofy says that. Oh, sorry. But yeah, so this is obviously, I saved it to the end because I think it's one of the juicier topics, right? Probably one of the more pertinent to our everyday lives, right? Because, and in as much as we've sort of been hinting at this idea or coming back to this idea that maybe your beliefs affect your actions, then yes, right? Then your religious beliefs are going to imply something about how ethical you are, or are not, right? And so we need to explore that relationship a little bit. So, what I've done in this week's module is provided you with three PowerPoints. One that focuses on what we're going to talk about today, which is the Euthyphro problem, right? The very classical problem. And then on Thursday, we'll have a conversation about Zagzebski and Anderson and Adams, and this basically all trying to respond to the Euthyphro problem, right? But we want to get a sense of what this problem is first. But in order to first really appreciate the problem, though, I did also want to give you guys a sense of what it would look like to learn about ethics if this wasn't a religion class, right? So I have recommended in this week's module, in the resources, but also you'll see the first PowerPoint is a full intro to ethics. Okay, so that is, you are not accountable for all that, right? For knowing all that. But if you were just learning about ethics in a regular intro to philosophy class, you would learn about divine command theory, which is what we're talking about this week, but you would also learn about a lot of other ethical theories, right? So I want to make it clear that while there is a presumed relationship between religion and moral behavior, or again, lack thereof, depending on your position, the idea is that there are plenty of ways to conceive of ethical theories, right? Which is a theory about what makes something right or wrong. There are plenty of ways to conceive of that do not require religious foundations, right? So that intro to ethics is a thorough overview, but just for a brief overview, you'll want to go to the gig philosophy page, right? That's also in our module, but I'm going to share the link in the chat here directly, right? And just get a sense of, and you can see it on the chart that's towards the bottom, right? You can get a sense that there are like 6 basic ways we can approach understanding what makes something right or wrong. And the ones on the left are on the left together for a reason. The ones on the right are on the right together for a reason. Okay, so the ones on the left of the chart, these are what we call action-based theories, meaning that they judge rightness or wrongness based on individual actions. Okay, so when you are looking at the actions themselves, just individual actions, you could look at the consequences of the action. That's going to be the first two, egoism and utilitarianism. Those are types of what we call consequentialism, right? Because they judge based on the consequences of the action, either for yourself only, which is egotism, right? Or for everyone involved, which is utilitarianism. Okay, so those are both just different types of being a consequentialist, right? So classic example, is it okay to lie? Well, a consequentialist would say it matters depending on the consequences of the lie, right? Is the lie going to maximize the greatest amount of pleasure or good or whatever it is that we value, right, as a consequentialist for you and possibly for everyone else, right? If so, then it's the right thing to do. If not, then it's the wrong thing to do, right? So it's entirely dependent upon the consequences, whether or not something is right or wrong. Deontology, on the other hand, is a rule-based ethic. Okay, so not consequence-based, rule-based. Meaning that we judge actions not based on their outcomes, but based on whether or not something about the act itself that's going to make it right or wrong. And so there are 2 different deontological approaches historically. There is divine command theory, which is the idea that there is a code or a set of rules or principles that we have to live by, and your actions are right or wrong depending on whether or not they're in correlation with the rules, right? But those rules have already been given to us by God, right? That's divine command theory. Okay, whatever God wills or commands is what is right. Okay, so whether or not our actions are in line with those rules is going to determine their rightness or wrongness. There is historically another type of deontology which gets associated with Immanuel Kant, so it's called Kantian deontology. Now, Kant is a theist, so don't think that this is like an atheist's deontology, right? So Kant was a theist, but for him, everything was about human reason, right? And so for him, yeah, there are moral rules, but we can't trust other people to tell us what God has said they are, right? Reason will tell us what they are, right? The human capacity to reason and reason well or be rational. Okay. And so for him, he's going to have this whole system of rationally determining what the rules are. It's called the categorical imperative. It's in the PowerPoint if you'd like to learn about it, right? But this involves things like never treating people as a means to an end, right? Making sure the rules can be maximized for everyone. And the motivation for him here is he wanted morality to be like a law of nature, right? So if something was right, it's right for everybody in every situation at every time. Same if something is wrong. That kind of stuff is really attractive to us, right? So like when we look back throughout history and we want to say something was wrong, even back then, even when no one thought it was, we typically are appealing to something like what Kant is talking about here. Like if it's wrong now, it should have been wrong back then too, right? So he wants morality to be like a law of nature, right? Something that holds true at all times. But he thinks that human reason can tell us what those rules are. Okay, so two different types of deontology, just like there are two different types of consequentialism. Okay, just for yourself or for everyone involved. Deontology, the rules, either reason can tell us what they are or God has dictated what they are. Okay, and then of course we have to figure out which God, right, and which set of religious rules for divine command theory. The other side of the list, if you're interested, those are known as agent-based theories, meaning that they don't judge individual actions like the ones on the left. Instead, they judge the people, the moral agents who engage in those actions. Now, moral agents and people are not necessarily one and the same. A moral agent is someone who is responsible for their actions, right? So not all people are moral agents, right? We can imagine some people who we would not hold responsible for their actions, such as, anyone think of any? Who are some human beings we would not hold responsible for their actions? Who else are we not holding responsible for their actions? Infants, children, right? Up to a certain age. Yeah, baby people. You mentioned with various cognitive decline or dementia, right? That we can imagine lots of things there.
The elderly.
The elderly. Okay. So maybe just if, yeah, is it just at a certain age or
I just say because someone's old,
right?
they can.
Right. Yeah, whereas other people are not, even earlier on. Yeah, so something about their cognitive capacity or yeah, so if someone is having clinical like cognitive decline in some way, good. Good, right? There are also ways in which we might think we might not hold people responsible if, say, they weren't in full control of themselves, right? Like if someone had been drugged or, right, under the influence of something that they were not themselves responsible for putting themselves in that position, right? We might give them some leeway, right? So just note that a moral agent doesn't just refer to all people. And there are also some philosophers nowadays who are arguing for animal rights, who want to argue that animals are moral agents, right? And they typically want to argue that because they want to show that animals can be moral exemplars sometimes. Like we should be emulating some of their behavior, right? It's not just like random neurons firing and, lesser creatures. Like they are sentient and they have reason and they are capable of emotion and so many things, right? When you see, like, I'm sure you guys have seen or videos of animals like of different species that are supposed to be like one's the predator and one's the prey, but the predator comes and like saves the prey from, drowning or something. And it's like, wow, evolution doesn't have a whole lot to say about that. I mean, cooperation, yes, but right, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evolutionary biology that explains some of those exceptional acts, or like when dolphins, have saved surfers or things like this. So there's some really interesting ways that people have tried to even ascribe moral agency outside of humanity, right? So just know moral agents, right? We hold them responsible for their actions. And the idea is that moral agents can reason, right, to what the moral principles are for Kant, but for the theories on the right, the idea is that we shouldn't be judging individual actions, right? When judging an agent, we need to look at habits over a lifetime, right? It's a character, it's a whole picture. So these theories on the right are much more context dependent, right? And don't necessarily just look at one thing, right? Whether or not the action had good consequences or whether or not it followed a rule. So if you are a relativist of some sort, then you think that actions are right or wrong depending upon either cultures or individuals or whatever type of relativist you are, right? And that can be a very generous way of going about things and ascribing moral judgment. I think a lot of college students are inclined to be moral relativists. But just know that if you are truly a moral relativist, it means that there is no objective moral truth. Okay, so that means that there is no external thing to which we could point to if there's disagreement between individuals or between cultures about right or wrong. It really just depends on the culture. Okay. It really just depends on the individual. So if you go that route, just be prepared to defend that, right? You're not going to be in a position to make judgments of other individuals or other cultures, right? If you're truly a relativist in that way. The truth is literally determined by, again, whichever measurement of relativism you're using. Virtue and care ethics are different, right? So they're looking at the agent, right, and the context, but there is objective truth, right? It's just more complex and convoluted than any of the action-based theories want to say. So virtue ethics is looking at the habits that you cultivate over a lifetime. So there are some religious traditions which advocate for things like virtue ethics, right? Modeling our behavior after someone who lived a really great life, right? We see elements of that in the Abrahamic traditions, right? We see elements of this throughout the Eastern traditions as they're looking to, gurus and teachers that we should emulate, right? So there's lots of virtue ethical components in the major world religions, but on the whole, they tend to be types of deontology, right? Specifically types of divine command theory. If you're looking more at relationships than just cultivating a good character, right? That's something that, involves a community and how we treat other people. Then you might be looking at something more like care ethics, right? So this is the idea that in order to be a good person, it's not just about you and, you being the best you can be. Like it's about you within the context of the social environment in which you live. And so being a good person means cultivating caring relationships with other people, right? So that is going to dictate all types of things about what's right or wrong. And just like in virtue ethics, where there is no, one answer, there is going to be cases in which you can be too much of a good thing, right? So in virtue ethics and care ethics, they operate with something called like the doctrine of the mean, like the average, the middle. Okay, so not ever going too little and not ever going too much. Okay, so that's what's going to dictate what is virtuous. That's what's going to dictate what's best for caring relationships as well. So there's a lot of really interesting feminist care ethicists who talk about how care and love can become vicious, right? When they're no longer virtuous. Like clearly we know when these things can be too much, right? So just the idea is that, again, it's not just all or nothing, clear, black and white. There's all sorts of gradation and nuance in understanding what makes someone a good person, right? And understanding the right thing to do. So just know that divine command theory is one of many, many, many possibilities, right? And is present throughout the world in different traditions. Okay, so questions about just ethics broadly and this conversation about what makes something right or wrong or what makes a person virtuous or not. No? All right, so the last little bit of fun I'll leave you with from the intro to ethics. crash course that you just got is that one of the ways that philosophers historically like to test your intuitions about these theories and which one, you most identify with is with hypothetical experiments, right? The thought experiments. And the reason that we use these is because they're crazy and outlandish, right? Just straight up. But it's supposed to test the extremes of right and wrong, right? And so the idea is that if our ethical theories can handle these wild thought experiments, then they should be good to go on all the regular stuff that we have to deal with, right, on an everyday basis. But what's really fascinating is the crazy hypothetical thought experiments that philosophers have been using forever are now actually being used by people who program things like self-driving cars. So, have any of you heard of the trolley problem? Trolley problem? If there's 5 people tied to the track and only one person on the other side, and you can't get to them in time, but all you can do is pull the lever, and the lever will redirect the trolley away from 5 people towards the one. So your moral dilemma then is to let 5 people die. That's if you do nothing, or to kill one person, right? And so this is the classic, deontology versus consequentialist debate, right? Do we judge the action based on its consequences or about something inherent to the act of killing someone, right? Versus letting someone die. So again, fascinating, strange hypotheticals. Literally, they are programming self-driving cars to make these kinds of decisions, right? Do I hit a pedestrian? Do I hit another car? Or if any of you have watched the show Upload, do I prioritize driver in a car crash versus prioritizing people outside of the vehicle, right? So again, they seem crazy. Someone's going to have to make these decisions at some point, right? It may be you. So what would you do? Other classic examples, and they make fun of this in the show The Good Place, so you should definitely watch that show if you haven't watched it already, is, if you were a surgeon and you had, 5 patients who were dying, and they could all be saved by one person, who just we're all a match. They just need one donor, and some homeless person stumbles in, right? And they happen to be a match. Should you murder the homeless person, right, to save the 5 patients? Utilitarianism might say, yeah, right? Right? So we have to weigh out these types of things because a lot of people think like governments should be utilitarian, right? That we can't make it good for everybody, so we should just maximize the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. Well, what does that really mean in terms of the, bare bones, down nitty-gritty decisions of it all, right? What sort of ethical rules do you think should govern fairness and justice, right? Like in our legal system. So that gets into whole other areas of philosophy as well. So lots of rich stuff here to explore. All right, so this gets us into, again, a very, very famous problem in philosophy known as the Euthyphro problem. It's called Euthyphro because this is one of Plato's dialogues, and Plato wrote his dialogues named after the people that Socrates was supposedly dialoguing with, right? So the literal name of the dialogue will tell you who Socrates is talking to. Okay, so the Euthyphro, right, is Socrates and Euthyphro having a conversation. The Meno is Socrates and Meno having a conversation. Okay, that's the rule of thumb for Plato's dialogues. But what's classic or famous about this particular dialogue is that it seems to have posed such a immense theological dilemma that Christian theologians still struggle, right? And I don't just mean Christian. That's a bias of Western philosophy, but Abrahamic philosophers of religion and theologians have struggled to reconcile this dilemma and still struggle with it today, right? And it's called a dilemma because it's going to pose us with 2 options. And there are dilemmas that can have more than 2, right? And they call them horns. I don't know why. So dilemmas can have many horns. This dilemma has 2 horns, right? But the idea is that I think they're horns because they're pokey. And a dilemma is when neither option is good, right? So yeah, that's why they're horns, because you don't want either one of them. Okay. So the horns of the dilemma, right? A dilemma is something where neither or none of the options available to you are good, right? Like, so saying things like between a rock and a hard place, right? That's what a dilemma is, right? It's something where either option or whatever of the options are provided, they all have issues with them. And so this Euthyphro dilemma is about the relationship between God and goodness. Okay. And we can sort of understand it just really on the surface level of it as like a chicken or egg situation. Which one came first? But really, it's like which one relies on the other one, right? So the question or the dilemma, right, that Socrates poses Euthyphro just in the marketplace one day, right? And the famous conversation that we're still talking about now is, well, if we're talking about what is good, what is pious, what is right, right, what God loves, does God only love it because it's in line with what God happens to like? Or was it already good? And that's why God loves it, right? So the question is about dependence upon God. If something is good, is it good simply because God loves it or wills it or commands it? Or was it already good and that's why God loves it and commands it and wills it to be so? Right? And so again, this is a dilemma because no matter how we answer the question, it's problematic for God. Right? So two horns of the dilemma. That's what we're going to be looking at. Now, there are lots of other potential problems with divine command theory. So before we dive too far into the Euthyphro problem, I'm going to share one more thing with you. Where did you go? God and ethics. Okay, so on the God and ethics gig page, if you scroll down to the 3 infographics that are like the long rectangle ones, you'll see the first one is all about divine command theory. So 7 problems with divine command theory. Right? So the Euthyphro problem and then the first horn and second horn of the dilemma. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. But there's other issues. So take a look at that as well as the PowerPoint for some other potential issues with divine command theory, right? Mostly having to do with religious diversity, which we're going to talk about next week. Right. So which is why I'm not going to spend too much time on that now. But it is important to note that if you're saying that what is right is what God commands, well, then which version of God's commandments, right, are the ones that we're supposed to follow? Which God? Right? Which God, which set of rules? Okay. Furthermore, there's some other questions in terms of like motivation, right? Is it really the best thing if you're only doing what's right because you're afraid of like the punishment? Right? So, I usually, if we were in class, I'd be like, so I presume you all didn't like murder anyone on the way to class today, right? You all say no. And I'd say, well, is the only reason you didn't do that is because you don't want to go to hell? Like, no, right? That would be a terrible reason for not murdering people. Hopefully you didn't murder anyone because that's not the kind of person you are and you don't have hate in your heart and violence, right? Like all those other things, right? We don't typically like means to end motivations in terms of like moral praise. Those are not the things that, we tend to praise the highest. Right. So same thing. Think of when you're raising kids, right? You're trying to teach them right or wrong. If you're only doing it based on reward and punishment, then you're only teaching them to like the rewards and dislike punishments. You're not really teaching them what is right or wrong about anything. Right. So again, there's some questions there about what the best motivation or justification might be. But the primary question we're going to be looking at again is the relationship between God and goodness. Okay, so there's a little bit in the PowerPoint to go over the Socratic method with you, but hopefully we're all, familiar enough with that. You've also seen Plato a few times in this class, right? So hopefully you're familiar enough with his style of writing to understand the general gist of it, which is that Socrates is the one who asks questions, right? And the idea is that the person in responding to Socrates's questions sort of winds themselves into a trap, right? So it's not just random questions that Socrates is asking, right? They're very strategic, right? So you might think of them as leading questions, questions leading them to come to their own conclusion, right, of what the right thing is, or that like, oh, I'm helping you realize yourself that you were mistaken, right? So again, it's very much like in our writing assignment when we're doing the reductio, sort of like that, but through strategic question and answer. Like, oh, you think this? Well, let me ask you some questions. Oh, now that's absurd. Oh no. Like, oh, I had no idea that we were going to wind up here. Well, better go back, right? And revisit some of those presumptions. Okay, so very, very much like that. And I've also got I actually got to visit the Agora and the marketplace where this specific dialogue took place. So the pictures that are at the end of the row of those are actually those stalls on the right are where the stores were, and the pillars, like that was all, it's all been redone, but that was all supposedly there when Socrates and Euthyphro had this conversation. So I tried to find the place where the conversation supposedly took place so you can get the sense of where they were when they did this. But the basic idea, again, is this question. Is the good commanded by the gods? Again, this was pre-monotheism, right? So there's many gods. Because it is good, or is it good because it is commanded by the gods, right? So again, which one comes first? Their commanding of it or the thing's goodness, right? In other words, does goodness rely on the gods in order to be good, or is it good independently of God or the God's wills? Okay. So then on slide 25, you can see a couple different ways of understanding, right? What it means to be good, what it means to be pious, right? So this is, again, exemplary of what we're doing in philosophy. We're getting at what words mean, right? Okay, so when we say that something is good, something is right, something is pious, right? What exactly do we mean by these things, right? And so they go through a couple of different definitions, but again, the question is whether or not morality may be independent of the will of the gods. So the gods' commandments to abstain from various wrong actions necessarily, or if they're not dependent, means that that's not what makes the action wrong. So for example, if goodness and right and wrong exist independently of God, right? Then when you do something wrong, it's just because it's wrong, not because you violated God's commandments, right? So we can maybe best think of this in the context of an Abrahamic story, right? Specifically, the story of Abraham. Are you still there? Yay. Okay, good. Sorry. Stupid laptop. All right. So the Abraham story that most people are familiar with is the one where God commands him to kill his son, right? So if we recall, the story is such that God commands him to do this, right? Under traditional divine command theory, that means that if Abraham had done it, which he tried to do, he tried to go through with it, right? Before God changed his commandment, right? Which is how the story ends. God changes his commandment. Seeing that Abraham was going to go through with it, tells him he doesn't have to. But if that last part hadn't had happened, right? If God had never changed the commandment and Abraham went through with it, that would have been the right thing to do if goodness depends upon God's will, right? Now, most people think in a biblical case that, yeah, that would have been the right thing to do. I don't know if they would grant that same level of generosity to people nowadays who claim to kill their children because God told them to. Plenty of people have made this claim and truly believed it. Right? Again, now we put them in medical places, right, to receive treatment. So if God commanded you to do something that didn't correspond with your sense of morality, right? If you think goodness depends upon God, then that disparity with your intuition shouldn't matter, right? Because what is right depends upon God's command and God's will. Now, the presumption, though, is that God does not change, right? And so is not going to be changing their mind willy-nilly. But divine command theory does not preclude that from being the case. Okay. God needn't be steadfast in their will or commands. And should a god or gods change their commands at any point, that then would become the right thing to do. And the former would no longer, right? So we really have to think about what is entailed by this dependency, right? So if you think that goodness is dependent upon God's will, then we have to accept that if God commands us to do something that we think is wrong, doesn't matter what our intuitions about it are, because we are not infinite and, wise and omniscient and, all the omnis. We're not those things, right? God is those things. That's why God gives us the rules. Okay. So we can see why this ends up being potentially problematic for God. Why is it potentially problematic for God for goodness to depend upon them? That seems like the best case scenario, right? Don't we want goodness to depend upon God? What could potentially go wrong here? Absolutely, right? And so, theologians are going to have to do some explaining, right, with stories like Abraham to try to reconcile that with a God that's not supposed to change, right? Not supposed to just change their mind, because that would imply a lack of perfection, right? But then how do we account for elements like the story of, creation in the Garden of Eden, and God is looking for like they're really weird instances of God all of a sudden not having all the knowledge or something, right? So again, it depends on if we're taking a literal interpretation or a metaphorical one, right? And so some people might go more metaphorical here and say, well, God never really intended for Abraham to kill his son, right? It was just a test. That's the most common interpretation, right? Is that God never would really will for someone to kill their offspring, right? But it was simply a test of their faith and their willingness to follow God's command. Again, though, what else does that say about this kind of God, right? It's some interesting. There's some interesting explaining we have to do in that regard, and it doesn't make God look. God doesn't come out looking the best when we start engaging in these explanations, right? It becomes very like manipulative, very cruel, almost sadistic, maybe, depending on how far one is, looking at the various narratives. Right. And there are lots of rules in biblical scripture that we would now look at and say, that's terrible, right? Like, stoning a woman who leaves her house while she's menstruating. Hi, Cease. I know I don't like that one either. Right? We disagree. We disagree with it. Oh, I'm going to say hi. I terrified you. Okay. This is Cece. Hello. Goodbye. Right? So again, which set of rules are we getting? Right? What do these rules say about the divine being? And so, yeah, either God doesn't change their mind, right? Which seems better, in which case then they're just testing or fucking with people, right? When they, forgive my language, but basically it comes off that way, right? Um, or they do change their mind. That's, I think, even scarier, right? Is a God who's updating their belief. Like, that's good for humans because we're fallible. We're supposed to learn from our mistakes. Not so great for an omniscient, omnipotent being. And there are some interpretations of theology that might account for like a God that ages, but that just seems to like that's a very anthropomorphized notion to ascribe to a being that doesn't have physical form. So again, it's raising a lot of the questions that we've looked at this quarter, right? About what type of God we're looking at and what is our reason to believe that such a being would actually exist, right? So even if what is good is only good because it depends on God, which again seems like it should work out for God because God's, the one that everything's dependent upon still. It doesn't, again, make God look like the type of God that's typically ascribed, right, by these major religious traditions. So the first horn of the dilemma. A more philosophical criticism of this first horn is that it makes God's goodness meaningless. And we can understand this in terms of a simple hypothetical syllogism or something like this. Or the math equivalent is, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, right? This sort of thing. Okay, so if goodness, under this first understanding, is just whatever God wills, then what does it mean when we say things like God is good? Well, goodness isn't anything independent of God, right? It's just what God happens to like or love or whatever the adjective is you want to describe it. So if goodness is just God's will, then God is God's will. Like that it just becomes a meaningless statement at that point, right? And so when we talk about God being omnibenevolent, we think we're ascribing something new to the concept of God, right? That there is this ultimate all-powerful being, but that it also happens to be all good. It could be evil too, right? But it is all good. And so that would seem to imply the other horn of the dilemma, right? That goodness is in fact not dependent upon God's will. And the problem here should be very clear. What's the problem with the second horn? The problem for God, anyways. Things are good independent of God. Why is that problematic for God? Potentially, right? So it's definitely going to be a threat to any sense of an all good God, potentially, right? Because then it opens up the possibility that what God does could be evil. But more importantly, it means that God is not the thing upon which everything else depends, right? God was supposed to be this necessary thing, right? Remember back to our arguments for God's existence at the beginning of the quarter? Everything else is supposed to be contingent. But if there is another necessary thing out there, that threatens God's existence, right? God is supposed to be the only necessary being, right? The being upon which all other things depends. So if something like goodness can exist independently of God, it threatens God's omnipotence as being the most powerful thing, the necessary thing, which, as we saw with the ontological argument, right, means it's going to threaten God's existence altogether. So again, is God's will the source of all morality? If so, then yeah, the divine is omnipotent and creates everything, including moral values. But that then makes our moral intuitions arbitrary, right? Because again, we talked about what happens then if we disagree with the divine. And then without the divine, there is no right or wrong. Okay. Is absolute morality the source of God's will then, right? Is it independently existing? That's the second horn. Well, then values of right or wrong are absolute and lie outside of what God commands. But then morality has nothing to do with God, right? And then even gods must conform to those rules, especially if they're meant to be all good. Now something has the power over God. Oh, can't have that. Right? Very, very threatening to the being that is supposed to be the most powerful. Okay, so this is the reason that it is referred to as the Euthyphro problem or the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Because no matter which option we take, neither ends up looking too good for God. At least not the way gods or the gods have traditionally been portrayed, right? As all good. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left of class. Any questions about the dilemma or why each horn is problematic for God? Okay, so the second horn, right, where goodness is independent of God, threatens God's existence, to sum it up. The first horn doesn't threaten God's existence, but it doesn't work out looking too good for God, right? Doesn't wind up giving us a picture of divine goodness that is meaningful or rich in any sort of way, right? Sort of becomes redundant. Okay, well, I don't want to jump into the next PowerPoint before next Thursday. I'm dedicating that for Thursday. So again, that last slide will give you an overview of some of these other problems. I guess we could talk about number 5 really quick. That's the only one we didn't talk about from the poster, which is another potential issue with divine command theory is even if you have decided which God and which set of rules, right, is the right one and the one that you're going to follow, these rules are often incomplete or unclear, right? They don't always apply to every moral dilemma that you're going to encounter in your life, right? So what is one to do then to try to extrapolate from the rules, right? To try to deal with the things that aren't clear and cut and right. I mean, I know George Carlin makes a joke about how you can boil down like the 10 commandments to 2 or something, right? In general, there's a wide variety of issues one has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of things are sort of in the gray area. It's not very clear what the right thing to do is all the time. So, yeah, I mean, look at, these are cases that people are dealing with right now in the world, and a lot of them are making their decisions based on religious reasoning. So I'm going to use this as an example. You might have read about the woman who is being kept alive, right? So she is otherwise brain dead and physically could not keep herself alive without machines. But she's pregnant. And so the family is trying to relieve her, but the state is keeping her alive to deliver the baby. And there's a question here about what the right thing to do is, right? In terms of ending life, in terms of to whom you think you have the obligations, right? Even going back to Kantian deontology, do you think we have a right to treat people just as a means to an end, right? Can we just use people's bodies for whatever purposes we want, right? There are all sorts of really ambiguous moral questions. And there's a discrepancy between what different people think is right for different reasons. So how do we resolve it? Right? Well, we have to first understand what their reasons are, right? And so what are the potential justifications for keeping her alive? What are the reasons potentially for not keeping her, right? And let's weigh those out and assess them. But again, this stuff might seem like, oh yeah, God's good and goodness, and no, it's very abstract. Real world implications, though, right? Once we get down the line, and we will again, we'll follow through on Thursday, but we will especially see this next week when we talk about religious diversity and pluralism. All right, well, hang out for the next couple minutes in case any of you have any questions, but otherwise, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you on Thursday.